Well, hello and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're all suitably refreshed and enjoyed the delicious repast that's been laid on for you by our lovely hosts here. Welcome to the afternoon session. We have two sessions this afternoon, and this first one is going to be talking mainly about delivery of data and is conspicuous by the presence of Department for Transport input. And we thank you very much for joining us to talk to the road safety community about that. Just before we move on to the content of the session, can I just remind everybody that coming up in November 2023 is the Road Safety Great Britain annual conference, which will be held at the delightful lakeside venue. This is being displayed on the screen here, the De Vere Cotswold Water Park Hotel. So I'm sure we'll all be jumping in for a quick dip in between sessions. That gives us something to look forward to in November. So please log on to the website shown there and book your places as soon as you can. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to the first of several presentations from the Department for Transport that we have to enjoy in this session. And I'm going to introduce to you someone who will be totally unfamiliar because she is the new Deputy Director of Data, Insight and People Analytics Division. But she's probably not totally unfamiliar to you because she's had a long career as a statistician in DFT, being involved in road safety and transport data. And Catherine Williamson is going to give us an overview of where DFT see the landscape in the coming time. I hope that's not misrepresenting you, Catherine.
That's fine, thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had a nice lunch. Thank you for having me back at this conference. I think I've been here a number of times now, often with a different hat on. So, as Bruce said, I'm a statistician. I started in the Department for Transport working on Stats 19 review and crash. I then defected to policy for a while and was working on various things around road safety. And now I'm working on data more widely for the Department for Transport. So I'm the acting Chief Data Officer, which is absolutely terrifying. And I'm talking to you today about the transport data strategy. So, transport data, we all love it, but why do we need a strategy? So, we're all here today to talk about road safety. Really important, really vital. But there's lots of other stuff going on that links to road safety. So we've got big things going on around future of mobility. We've got various things about decarbonisation. We've got bus back better, which is really, really important, despite the name of the report. And we've got the Williams-Shapps review, which is about the rail. All of these things actually have a big link to road safety because it's all about mode of choice, mode of transport. And actually, as we saw from the presentations this morning, the choices available to people and how they travel and how they get around are really important. But there are some challenges. And if we really want things to be truly multimodal, there are challenges we need to address. One of them is data sharing and data access. And that came up in some of the conversations this morning about all the data we would like to have. Where is it? Who's got it? How do we access it? And this isn't being done in isolation. The government as a whole is thinking quite a lot about data at the moment. One thing the pandemic really did was focus our minds on the importance of real-time data. You saw every day people stand up and talk about things with really quick data sources. That was new, that was innovative. Lots of it was from places we hadn't looked before. It was doing things in a way we weren't used to. It was no longer the NatStats gold standard we'll publish in 18 months. All of that has changed the way the government wants to consume data, the way the public expects us to consume data, and the way the industry operates with data. So there's a lot going on in the transport space. So, to support the goals of the department and what we want to do around data, we've been trying to work out where the gaps are and what we need to do about them. And specifically thinking about what the underlying barriers are to data access and data sharing. And to do that, we need to think about the transport data infrastructure. Make sure we've got what's described here as a data ecosystem. And by that, we kind of mean that data in isolation doesn't tell you an awful lot. It's when you start to understand context, it's when you start to link data sets together that you really get the powerful insights. And those data sets or those pieces of analysis can be really varied. Stats 19 is a really rich and important data set that we all use and all value. But it's when you link it to other data sets, you begin to get new insights. We've heard about the value of the National Travel Survey this morning. We've heard about the value of social research and behavioural insights. It's when you put all of that together into an ecosystem that you really begin to understand what's going on and what you want to do about it. And then we've got the challenges between different modes and different geographic areas. We focus on the roads, but there's a lot of other stuff we need to think about. Lots of people that use the roads might not just be using the roads. They might use the car somewhere and then get on the train. They might walk, they might cycle. Lots of journeys are multimodal. So we need to think about transport more generally and more round. And we also need to think about how it relates to other important sectors, like energy, and actually some of the more innovative stuff that's being discussed around automated vehicles. So, what does that mean in practice? So what it means in practice is there are data barriers. There are things we want to try and address to be able to make all of this easier. And for you, and all the people that you work with, to be able to do your jobs better and really make a difference and save lives on the road. So the first thing we want to think about is discoverability. Who can tell me that they think they know where all the transport data is that they would like to get their hands on? Do you think you know how to access it all? Do you think you know where it all is? No. And that's because actually a lot of data isn't particularly easy to discover. There's more we can do to make it easier for people to find the right data sources and get access to those data sources. And with that comes the next point. We picked up in the last panel discussion about the importance of privacy, security, and importantly, ethical concerns around data. I think it was mentioned that it can get a bit creepy. And actually, it's really important that we have the right framework around data. It's really important that things like GDPR are complied with, but it's equally important that where data can be shared, there's a mechanism to allow people to be able to do that. A lot of that does link with our legal, monetary and contractual frameworks. Some data is held by private companies, some data is held by governments, some data is held by third parties. And it's how you can bring that all together, how you can work through those barriers to allow people to access the information they need. The next point is a more general one and doesn't necessarily apply to people in this room, but there is a gap around being a data literal culture. People know they want data, they don't necessarily know what data means. They want analysis, but they don't necessarily know what analysis they want. How many people have been in meetings with people and they say, can you give me evidence to prove X? They're not necessarily want the evidence per se, they want a sound bite, and actually there's a big role to play in upskilling people that we work with, and in my world that goes from the ministers downwards to make sure that they really understand what data is, what it does, what it doesn't do, the limitations and the context and how it should be used. So we've really got a data literate culture. And then there are the technical skills. As data gets bigger, it gets more powerful, but you need a different skill set to be able to access and work with that data. When I first joined government, one of the things I had to do was take information from VAT receipts and type them into an Excel spreadsheet so we could collect information on returns. Bruce, you're laughing, but I'm not kidding. Now we're talking data sets hosted in the cloud, millions upon millions of rows. It's a very different skill set to analyse and work with data now than it was 20 years ago. It will be very different again in 20 years in the future. So we need to be on the forefront of thinking about what the skills are that people need to be able to work with these kind of data sets, to be able to get the kind of insights that we want. We need to understand what the lack of incentives are to invest in data. We know it's really valuable. We want it. We want more of it. But what is the value of data? If you had to do a benefit-cost ratio for investing in a new data set, how would you justify that? How would you justify that investment? And that's a really difficult thing for us to grapple with. Because actually, in a resource-constrained environment, if you want to go and collect new data, analyst says this will be interesting isn't enough. You've got to be able to justify what the benefits, what the returns will be on that data investment. And that's actually a really difficult thing to do. Next one. This is where I see whether or not you're all actually awake. Data standards and data quality. Making data available is great, but it's got to be good. It's got to be understood. It's got to be in a way that is consistent. Because if you're going to link data sets together, you really want consistency on how that information is collected and how it's handled. One of the big challenges is around location and geography. Actually, for a lot of our data sets, because we don't necessarily have that personal information, because for very good reasons it's not identifiable at the individual level, location becomes our primary mechanism for linking things together. So actually, we want consistency on how location is recorded. We want accuracy at the level at which location is recorded, because that gives you a way in to being able to link things together and get that new information. And actually, one of the roles for the Department for Transport is to have that leadership role, is to think about these challenges and go away and look at them. Because we can look at them at the centre and we can do it once and not make local authorities look at these things 152 times, because that's not efficient and it's not fair to ask local authorities to do that. So what's the Department for Transport thinking about doing? So within our data strategy, we're working towards understanding where we need to put our effort and what the role is for us in the centre. We know there's something about user needs and communication and really understanding from the sector what you want from transport data and how we can bring that together. And it's not just a case of understanding today, but understanding how that need evolves into the future. The centre has a real role of setting those standards and trying to decide actually what's the best way to collect information, to manage information, to give that consistency that's really needed. Then there's a role around discoverability and access. So some of you might know we have transport data, Find Transport Data is currently in public beta. It's a start, and it is only a start, but it's a start of a way of trying to collect information together on transport data, all in one place, as a library, as a bit of a catalogue. And actually, there are loads of projects being done across government on cataloguing data, understanding who holds what and where it is. And that's the first step for being able to understand what you can do with that information is who's got it, who's got access to it, who do I speak to if I want access. Then we come on to the tricky one, which is around governance, protection and ethics. Again, really important that we do something in the centre. How you handle data is really important. And while most of what we have in the transport sector might relate to things like infrastructure, and actually where the nearest bridge is, not particularly sensitive, if you're talking about things on road traffic collisions and personal information, there's a lot of sensitivity, there's a lot of ethics you need to consider. Skills, as I've already mentioned, a really big one, making sure people have the skills and the access to the technology they need to do their jobs. And then, what can we do about this data culture, data literacy, and the leadership we can provide to help support the sector in what they want from transport data going forward. This isn't easy. My last slide is just to show you just how complicated just even the Department for Transport is. There's us in the centre, there's agencies, there's ALBs, there's a whole load of other bodies like HS2 that we have a link to. It's not necessarily an easy task. There's a lot of people to discuss, a lot of things to do. But in a world where all these organisations work together to make data available, then we'll be in a far better place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. A lot of ambitions expressed in that presentation, which I think will give us all a better chance to engage successfully with data. Does anybody have a question they'd like to put to Catherine before we move on to the next presentation?
There's one in the front.
And this packed, right at the front. There you are.
Thank you. Can you understand?
Just behind you.
Oh, 2 mics.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a great presentation. In Ampel, we did a green paper on walking and cycling data that came out in December, and we interviewed 18 public authorities, and your list of barriers are very similar to the one we discovered in these interviews. But one thing you haven't mentioned is data equality. Because one of the issues for walking and cycling data is that is, for walking, not viewed always as something you need to collect at all. And then for cycling, it's also about there's a lot of data, but how do we create meaning, knowledge, insights from the data? Is that part of your scheme, making sure that walking, cycling, public transport and vehicle data actually are treated at the same level and have the same importance?
Yeah, and I think that's where the user needs a communication aspect is really important, understanding what people want, understanding where the gaps are, understanding where there is a role to play in closing those gaps is very much part of the sort of the user needs thing. As I've said, with transport, we view everything as multimodal. So, we don't necessarily view that roads are the be-all and end-all of someone's journey. Actually, even when someone says in the National Travel Survey that they've driven to somewhere, they've still walked a little way, right? You've not got directly in your car from outside the front door and directly into your office building. There's always going to be a degree of other types of mobility that go alongside it. So from our point of view, it's all important.
Okay, thank you for that. Good question. And we've got time for just one more question. So I have one in the middle here.
This will be fun.
Sorry, I don't profess to know where all the data I might want is, but I'm fairly confident that relatively little of it is in Great Minster House. So the question I have about that last page is, how does the data strategy relate to arm's length bodies with data strategies or data approaches that are fundamentally opposed, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I mean, nothing's in Great Minster House because we're all in the cloud. So yeah, it's all important. There are various degrees of how you were going to work through a strategy, but we want the arm's length bodies to be part of it. We're going to have conversations with the arm's length bodies. Data collected for operational purpose is different and has different rules around it, but ultimately it's all collected with taxpayers' money. So the whole point of a strategy is trying to understand what are the barriers to organisations, including the agencies, about releasing information, about governing their data, and what can we do to address them. Now, it might be there are some things it's not appropriate to release for a whole host of reasons. There might be cases where things aren't appropriate to release because they don't have the skills or the capability to do that. They're two very different problems. You have to understand those problems before you can design a solution.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that, Catherine. I'm sure you have completely answered all Ivo's questions. And so we're going to move on to the next presentation. Could I ask everybody to show your appreciation to Catherine, please? And I'd now like to introduce you to Mike Dark, who has been a statistician for many years in the Department for Transport. And he has recently been putting a lot of work into what I would say is a case in point of the general approach Catherine was talking about bringing together data from multiple sources in order to gain a better insight into an important road safety issue. Mike has been researching drink and drug driving and how we should detect and understand it. So if I could ask you to come up, please, Mike.
Thank you very much. This presentation, although we will touch on alcohol, drink driving, we've been doing that for some years, but the development of drug driving is a much newer area. As I say, we've been producing drink driving statistics since 1979. Not I was doing it, I was still in school. But the latest one is 2020. But there's been a policy requirement recently to measure the extent of drug driving as it's becoming an increasing issue on our roads. At the moment, we have two sources of drug driving data before this feasibility study. One was a crime survey. The problem with that is people have to admit to having been driving with too many drugs in their system, and given that the drugs are illegal anyway, a lot of people might not admit it, even anonymously. The second one is a contributory factor data, which is stats 19, where when the police attend the scene of a road collision, they can allocate factors which they believe contributed to the collision. This isn't about attributing blame, it's about saying, was this a factor? And impaired by alcohol and impaired by drugs are two of those factors that can be allocated. The contributory factor data impaired by drugs has shown an increase over time, as you can see from that chart, from 2013 to 2020, whereas impaired by alcohol has been gone down a bit, but reasonably stable, but if anything, fallen slightly, where drugs, as you can see, has really increased, particularly up till 2017. It's got to a much higher point. It's maintained the higher point, and as you can see, they're almost very similar. If this trend continues, of course, drugs may well even increase over the next couple of years, more than be recorded rather more than alcohol, because it's very, very close now. Where, as you can see, in 2013, it was not in the same ballpark. Now, the question is impaired by drugs being increasingly allocated by the police because there's an increase in drug use, or because the police are more aware of it and therefore may be more likely to, in the professional judgment, to consider it to be a factor? So because of that, we decided to have a feasibility study to try and measure this. There are some problems with this data at the moment. One is we do not have the results of drug tests under Stats 19 in the way that we do have a breath test result. Please take a breath test of alcohol, a pass or failure is recorded. We have no equivalent yet for drug tests. So we cannot produce drug driving stats in the way that we can produce drink driving stats. So we've therefore, as an initial step, had to restrict this analysis to cases where a driver has been killed in the road accident, has died in the road accident, and we take the coroner's data and we can determine whether they've got alcohol in their system, and if so, is it above the limit? Have they got drugs in their system? Is it above the limit? So you're comparing like with like. You're dealing with the extreme end of not just drug or drink driving, but to such an extent that the driver who's been taking either those alcohol or drugs over the limit has actually sadly died. However, producing estimates of drug driving, even when we're talking about fatalities, is not as straightforward as drink driving. In a sense, you look at drink driving, there's either alcohol in your system or there isn't. It's a binary choice. However, with drugs, it's not as simple as that. We have to distinguish between recreational drugs, or illicit drugs, on one hand, and prescribed drugs on the other, and then we have to look at the prescribed drugs, whether they're likely to impair driving or not. Paracetamol is a prescribed drug, isn't it? Unlike alcohol, where there's only one thing to test for, there are many different drugs which can impair driving, and they all have different legal limits, as I'll show you in the next slide. We also need to distinguish between which drugs were found in the body may have been administered by paramedics at the scene of the collision, rather than being taken by the driver prior to the collision. There are limitations about how and when drugs are taken, and how long they stay in the body after death. There's a lot of caveats which we need to bear in mind. As you can see by this chart, there is a list of the various drugs that are specified by legislation, and as you can see, the limits are radically different. I mean, you've got, for example, heroin or cannabis, which is 2 milligrams per litre, is the limit, compared to some of the medicinal drugs that are up to 500 times the level before they're considered to be to be impairing driving. So we have to look at each of these drugs individually. So the Department for Transport basically then commissioned a report from the National Programme for Substance Abuse and Deaths. They categorised the drugs into 9 particular categories. Don't need to go into all those now. There's only 3 that's relevant to this study. One is psychiatric medications. These are drugs that clearly impair potential. They could be medicinal, but they can also be abused. But basically, the psychiatric medications, drugs. The second one is what I call query psychiatric drugs. Now, this is a case where they could have been taken and abused by the driver prior to the collision, or they could have been given to the driver at the scene of the collision by a paramedic. We can't always be sure, but by comparing the different types of drugs that are found in that body, we can come to a judgment as to which was more likely. However, we can't always be sure. And then thirdly, there's drugs of abuse. These are drugs that have no medical use, such as cocaine and LSD, and so it's quite clear that they were taken before the scene, before the collision rather than after it. That's the background, and you can see how complicated the whole thing is to analyse. So we have got some results of this study. First of all, we look at the percentage of deceased drivers with impairment, drugs or alcohol has been detected. Now, this is a range and an estimate because we don't have a report for every single deceased driver. Sometimes tests are not being conducted because the coroner presumably has no reason to believe that there was drugs or alcohol in them, so they may not test them. So if we take the percentage of drivers that go over the limit, be it for drinks or for drugs, as a percentage of those tested, we're likely to get a percentage that's on the high side. Because, of course, they're more likely to test them if they think it's a possibility of the drugs being there in the first place. So you've got a bias there. On the other hand, if you take the percentage with drugs or alcohol detected as a percentage of all deceased drivers, including those where no report has been provided, it will be on the low side because of those we do not have a report, some of them potentially may have had drugs or alcohol in the body, and so that's going to be on the low side. So the true figure is likely to be between the two. This chart shows the ranges we can have. If you look at the blue lines, they're talking about alcohol. And the alcohol levels in 2014 was somewhere between 17 and 30%, depends on which of the measurements you use. And that's compared to between 16 and 24% in 2019. In other words, broadly similar. Depends which the low or the high rate you take. But, they haven't gone up massively. Drugs, on the other hand, the green lines, have gone up very, very rapidly. Between 11 and 20% in 2014, and now it's gone up between 19 and 28% in 2019, a very, very big increase. This appears to be consistent with our contributory factor data, which is where drug driving appears to have increased relative to drink driving over the last 5-6 years. Most of the cases have involved, as you can see with this chart, the drugs of abuse I mentioned earlier, those that have no medical use whatsoever. The query drugs is sort of very in the middle, but medicinal drugs is very, very low. Partly explained by with medicinal drugs, the limit for drug driving is very, very high. So you really got to have a lot of them in your system before it's going to be counted. But clearly, drugs of abuse, as you can see, is a very, very increasingly big problem. Interestingly, more drugs were detected in deceased drivers in their 30s than in any other age group. Not necessarily drivers at the younger end. Illegal drugs were mainly detected in drivers between 20 and 39, as you can see by that dark green line, bar. Medicinal drugs, not surprisingly, were more likely to be detected in older drivers, between 30 and 49-year-olds. Only in drivers aged 70 or more were medicinal drugs detected more than illegal drugs. Although the numbers there are so small, you can't really draw many conclusions from that. other than the fact that drivers that age are less maybe more likely to be very careful and not to be driving when they're over the limit of either drugs or drink. This slide I found very surprising when I was doing the analysis. Basically, let's start from the positive. 78% of deceased drivers had no drugs in the system at all. Good news. However, the number of drivers that had some drugs present was 22%. Half of those had drugs present, but less than a drug drive limit. But what is quite stark is of the remaining 11% that had drugs over the limit, 90% of that 11%, in other words, nearly 10% of the overall total, were more than twice over the limit. So if you're over the limit, as a driver's over the limit, then 90% likely to be more than twice over the limit. That's a very stark statistic and very worrying. Part of it may be, of course, because drugs stay in the system for far longer than alcohol. So what are the common drugs that are found? Well, the most common was cannabis, followed by cocaine. As you can see, the top five were more like detailed there: cannabis, cocaine. I can't pronounce the third one. Caffeine and morphine. You're talking about the most popular drugs. Interestingly, heroin was found in very few. But that was quite stark. Okay, this is the feasibility study. What are our proposed next steps? The proposed next steps is to, hopefully as a result of the Stats 19 review, to maybe get the results of drug tests so we can do a drug driving estimate in the same way that we've done drink driving estimates, and therefore we will be able to compare one to the other. And it won't be based on just the extreme end of drivers having to be killed during the collision in order for us to use the analysis. As I've explained, there's a lot of caveats in this which we kept in mind when looking at this, but we believe the results are promising in terms of the amount of data we've captured and the broad compatibility with other data sources, such as the contributory factors. So that is what we're looking at.
Can I ask you to wind up now, please, Mike?
Okay,
Thank you.
I'd like to hear your experiences on this. The slides will be circulated, and then any questions, I'd be happy to feedback whenever that would be useful for you. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Mike. Okay, so a lot of useful information there and an indication of how we can get a better picture of a very specific type of danger that exists on Britain's roads. And I know that the estimates of drink driving have been widely used for many years by road safety professionals, so having something equivalent on drug driving would be very useful. I'm going to move straight on now to the jam in the DFT sandwich in this session's presentation, which is Nathan Harpham from Transport, if you'd like to, from TRL. And he's going to talk about something which I know is very close to the hearts of a great many road safety practitioners, which is bikeability, and something that I think is a very important and much needed contribution, which is how effective is bikeability. He's going to talk about its evaluation.
Cool. Thank you, Bruce. I've never been referred to as the jam in a DFT sandwich before, but I'll take it. Hi, everyone. My name's Nathan Harpham, and I'm a data analyst at TRL. I'm relatively new on the kind of road safety analyst scene, and it's been really nice today to put a few names and bodies to faces that I've seen online. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the bikeability evaluation that we did at TRL recently. So first of all, what is bikeability? I'm sure many of you know bikeability, but for those of you that don't, bikeability is the government's national cycle training programme that focuses on equipping cyclists with practical skills so that they can cycle safely on UK roads. It's a critical component of the government's gear change policy that's looking at transforming the way that cycling is part of the transport system, and more than 4 million children have received this training since 2007. Just for a bit of audience participation, can you put your hand up if you've received bikeability training, or maybe your children have received bikeability training? Okay, great. So a lot of you know what I'm talking about. Great. So the Widening Participation Fund was a pot of money from the Department for Transport provided to the Bikeability Trust for training that was reaching previously underrepresented populations. So we're talking ethnic minority groups, we're talking female teenagers, pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, and pupils in areas of deprivation. So 44 of these projects were run during 2022, and over 9,000 children were engaged with these. And TRL conducted an evaluation of the WPF projects. I'll refer to the Widening Participation Fund as WPF because it's a bit of a mouthful. So very briefly on the evaluation mechanism. So we start with our theory of change, which tells us how the interventions and activities are going to lead to the desired outcomes of the program. And the desired outcomes of this pot of money, this new training, was increased participation in these bikeability training programs amongst these identified groups, and increased propensity to cycle amongst these identified groups. So in order to measure how well that's been achieved, we have an impact evaluation, and for outcome 1, we're comparing data from the WPF projects with our match comparison group data from the standard bikeability projects over the same period, which is our counterfactual. And for outcome 2, we had a non-experimental before-after design, which basically involved giving surveys to the participants of the training before they did the training, and then after, and comparing the two results. And a lot of statistical analysis went into this and was a core part of reporting on the results. Combined with that, we had the process evaluation, which focuses on how things were delivered and what worked well and what didn't. And this is particularly useful because it contextualizes the results that we have. It builds a richer picture, and also it gives us some really good learnings for similar things in the future. And that was largely done through questionnaires and case study interviews with the project leads. Now, for this presentation, I'm not just going to tell you the statistical results from the impact evaluation and the results from the process evaluation, but I want to come at this from two angles relating to the theme of this conference today. The first angle is that this was a success story, that the WPF managed to reach previously underrepresented groups really successfully. And the second angle I want to come at this from, in light of the fact that it was a success story, what can we learn from it? What can we learn from this new training program in terms of engaging previously underserved populations? And what can we learn about effective data collection and reporting relating to underserved populations? So let's start with the success story. So I'll throw up some charts. So I'm not going to read all the figures, but essentially we had, in the WPF project, a much higher proportion of females, a much higher proportion of pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, and particularly a much higher proportion of pupils in the pupil premium category, which we use as an indicator for deprivation. So nearly 30% of WPF participants were in the pupil premium category, compared with just 10% in the standard projects. We also saw a much higher proportion of different ethnic minority groups. So, for example, we had more than 3 times the number of Asian participants, and nearly 3 times as many black participants in the WPF projects than in the standard projects. And as someone who loves data, I'd love to be able to talk about the ins and outs of stats and data analysis, but that's not the purpose of this presentation. But of course, with large sample sizes, we had very small p-values. So not only looking at the statistical significance of these results, but the effect sizes to try and kind of quantify them and compare them, weigh them off against one another was really important. And we found that particularly the pupil premium measure and the ethnicity measure were particularly effective. And then we had our before-after analysis. So again, I'm not going to read out all these results, but we had, after the training, participants reported that they would cycle much more, as you might expect, but we had 50% of participants said after the training that they would cycle at least once a week, compared with less than a quarter before. We had increased confidence as well. We had nearly 2/3 of our participants said they were at least fairly confident after the training. 30% of participants before the training said they were not at all confident, which went down to 7% after. And similarly, we had the participants feeling much more safe. So we have our success story. So then we come to, well, what can we learn? Why was this effective? And I've kind of broken this down into 4 different overarching reasons here. So first of all, the importance of adaptability and preparing to be adaptable. So all sorts of different training sessions were delivered here, both in terms of the mechanisms, in terms of who they were reaching. We had community events, we had days out for teenagers who really valued that freedom that was giving them. We had different locations of delivery, so some projects were delivered through schools, which was really effective. Some were delivered at sports halls and parks and in combination with local authorities. Identifying key people and partnerships was really important. Working with the local community, with community leaders. Those projects that partnered with schools had little to no dropouts of participants, so that was really effective. And utilising pre-existing contacts was also really important. So we had a project that worked with a local Muslim women's cycling group and used that contact. And they'd already trained trainers in that group. So they were enabling that community not only to be part of the training, but to then train others within that community. And also in terms of resources, so acquiring cycles and providing cycles. And communication was really important as well. Early engagement, informal as well as formal communication, and really getting alongside that community. So the second thing would be relationships. Engaging the right network of people. Community leaders were really important to understand cultural values and cultural sensitivities within those communities. I think Nicola talked about very similar things earlier. Community events were really important. So one project linked with a Black History Month event, which was really effective. Engaging teachers to provide reassurance to pupils and do the training in their kind of comfortable setting was important. And also engaging parents through presentations to parents, through one-to-one phone calls so they felt comfortable with what their children were doing. I think one key angle to come at this from is barriers and enablers. So what are the key barriers for these groups? And how can we then enable them in light of those things? So bike access was a big one. We had quite a lot of people that were from low-income backgrounds, so they didn't have a bike, or they didn't have a very good bike. So providing cycles was really important to overcome that barrier. We had a lot of people who were worried about their image, worried that they didn't have a good enough bike, so they felt peer pressure from that. A lot of teenage girls said that they had quite low self-esteem, low confidence, particularly around males, and a lack of female role models cycling that they could look up to. So we had female-only sessions. We had sessions where the instructor was the same ethnicity, the same gender as those people that were in the session, so that they had those role models they needed. Providing cycles that were uniform, got rid of this idea of your cycle's better than mine. Cultural sensitivities were also really important to consider. So a number of ethnic groups had this kind of cycling's not for me norm that was perpetuating amongst that group. So engaging those leaders and enabling those leaders was really important within those communities. And similarly, parental attitudes. A lot of parents said that cycling was costly, it wasn't safe. So again, providing cycles and engaging with those parents was really important. And I've talked about a lot of this already, but tailored approaches were really crucial here. Female-only sessions, instructors that were experienced with students with special educational needs and disabilities. Family events, engaging the community was really important. And they also had Dr. Bike sessions, which basically involved a local mechanic coming in and checking out the bikes and equipping them with skills for maintenance, which people really valued. So I kind of summarize all of these things as having a flexible, holistic, community-based approach was really effective. And then finally, a bit on data collection and reporting. So I think my summary here would be that it was really important when collecting the data and reporting on it to balance 2 things. Firstly, flexibility. Now, what do I mean by flexibility? I mean catering for the diversity in collection methods. So a number of projects wanted to use hands-up approaches, for example, because they had children that they didn't want to fill out the surveys individually. So we had hands-up, we had different scales were used, so some used 3-point scales, some used 5-point scales, and so on. So enabling the project leads to collect data in an effective way for them, and reporting on things in a manner that enabled that different data collection. And of course, flexibility minimizes the data collection burden and enables more voices to be heard. But it was really important that we balance this with consistency, because we want to have consistent questioning, same questions, same format, consistent statistical outputs, because ultimately this is going to enable informative, clear and robust conclusions. So that's one key thing that really came out of this for me, that balance between flexibility and consistency. Got 1 minute, we can do this. And then a final few thoughts of things that were really important around data collection. Early engagement was really important, allowing time for survey development and piloting. Regrettably, we had one project with neurodivergent participants, and we couldn't agree in time a suitable set of scales with questions that we could ask them, so they were removed from the study. So in light of that in future, I think building in extra time to pilot surveys that really reach those groups where they felt comfortable giving us the data is really important. Missing data. Expect to have missing data and prepare for it. By very nature of the kind of groups we were trying to reach, the data was very likely to be missing, so have that built into your approaches. Considering indicators for target groups, we obviously had the pupil premium indicator as an indicator of deprivation, and we had the IMD indicator earlier, I think, that other people have mentioned that's useful for that. Collection, analysis, and combination was also really important, so not just collecting all the data and then deciding after that how we're going to analyse it, but building that into our approach. Ethical data collection. So we had gatekeepers who were essentially project leads and teachers at school gathering all the data for us rather than doing that ourselves. And then finally, reporting methods. The importance of considering the impact and the process evaluation together. So, for example, we found that projects that were targeting pupils with special educational needs and disabilities had a higher than average increase in the expected frequency after the training. And the process evaluation revealed that that was largely due to really tailored training for those pupils. They had the doctor bike sessions with the mechanics, they engaged families. One particular project targeted 2 schools that were really engaged with special educational needs and disability pupils. So that's a very whistle-stop tour, but hopefully that adds to this good picture we've got today from all these presentations. And I'll happily take questions if there's any time. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Nathan. Even though we are a bit short of time, in light of the importance of both bikeability in particular and the inclusivity agenda in general to many road safety practitioners, I will give an opportunity if anybody's got a burning question they would like to ask Nathan. I have one here. Thank you.
I am Steve Johnson from National Highways. Yeah, just a quick question. Is there a way that you can evaluate actually how successful the training was, other than surveys, the take-up?
Sorry, when you say actually how successful?
So measure the success. So
Can you elaborate a little bit more?
How did that lead to increased use of cycling, or
as in the kind of process evaluation stuff, thinking about why we're seeing the changes in frequency, the changes in confidence,
just
the
the success of it over and above a survey, sort of physically measure it. Is it possible to do that?
Well, I suppose that's a very big question. I suppose success to me is both a measure of what's come out of the survey and the statistics there, but also a measure of the case studies and the interviews. And there's a lot of things that I didn't have time to go into, but we had a lot of case studies that we had with different projects where they fed back to us, and largely I think things were very well received. But yeah, I think we can go bigger with data, and I'd love to be able to chat to people who had similar data. I mean, lots of interesting presentations today about active travel data and whatnot that we may be able to link to some of this that would provide a broader and richer picture.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Could I ask you to show your appreciation for Nathan? Thank you. Okay, and finally, moving on to the bread at the bottom of the DFT sandwich, I'd like to welcome Matthew Tranter, who is going to talk to us about taking our dear old friend Stats 19 and joining it to other data sources, I believe particularly with reference to fire data. Matthew.
Thank you. How long have I got, by the way? Because we're on time already, I think.
Steve, how long has Matthew got?
1 minute. Yeah, exactly. 12 minutes. Okay, right. Yeah, if anyone's been in DFT and had the sandwiches there, you know how dry that bread can get very quickly. Which brings me on to this presentation, which is about the Stats 19 review and a quick run through of some work we're doing to link Stats 19 to other data sources. So hopefully you know what Stats 19 is. And I'm hoping you've heard of the Stats 19 review. So back in the day, Stats 19 used to get reviewed roughly every 5 years to make sure it remains relevant. We've been getting a bit less frequent with those reviews in the past decade or so. But there was one which Catherine started in 2018. A few things got in the way to sort of delay the publication of the report. You may have heard of them. So that didn't come out till 2021. And hopefully you're familiar with the main changes that were recommended. All police forces moving to injury-based reporting, adding in the category for powered personal transporters, drug tests to mirror what we've got for breath tests, and evolving the contributory factors into the road safety factors and making them a bit more streamlined. It also set out, and here's Catherine again, the future data strategy for Stats 19, which specifies some of the sort of data linking we're going to try and do. So just a quick update on the implementation of the review and where we've got to. So yes, 2021 the report was published, and in the period between then and now, a lot of people, including Paul, who's over there, have been working very hard to set the specification, finalise the specification with software suppliers, police forces, the crash system, and so on. So we've got to the point now where at the end of January that was circulated as a near final draft, and it's out for comments by the 10th of March. If anyone's not seen that and wants to see it, then please drop Paul a line. Just as a warning, it's about 240 pages long, so it's good if you've got a wonky table with a gap like that. Then in April, we're going to have a meeting of the Standing Committee for Road Accident Statistics, or SCRAS, and that will be sort of a sign-off of that specification. And then over the summer, there'll be some work to do some testing, produce the Stats 20 document, which is the guidance on completing Stats 19. Crash will hopefully come on board with the new specification in the autumn, and then from the start of next year, national adoption, if all goes well. We're realistic. Not all police forces are going to meet that timescale. I think we've got some somewhat optimistic aim of the 1st of Jan 2025, but in reality it's probably going to be longer. I think always with these reviews it takes a few years for everyone to get on board. So that's the way forward. So we've been doing some stuff in DFT in the meantime to address some of those things that were recommended, but where we haven't got complete data yet. So injury severity, where police forces are already on the crash system, we're starting to publish that and make it available. So again, if you're interested in that more granular data for the serious category, then drop Paul a line. We've started publishing a high-level fact sheet on that, and that's what the top table is there, so you can see the very serious, moderately serious, and so on. E-scooters, we can publish some stats based on the free text that the police are reporting, so we've got fact sheets now that we're updating on an annual basis and we'll continue to do. And drugs, as Mike has already talked about, we're exploring what we can get from the coroner's data for those people that are killed. One thing that wasn't in the review, or was in the review but wasn't actually recommended, but we've just done anyway because a minister sort of nudged us to, is change the terminology in our statistics from referring to accidents to instead refer to collisions, which generally seems to have gone down well, but not everyone likes that. So we've done it. I'll briefly run through the future data strategy. So this was Catherine's earlier strategy, if you like, much narrower, just talking about Stats 19, and where there might be opportunities to make linkages to other data sources to address some of the known limitations, partly to minimise the burdens on police, and partly to add value, particularly around post-crash care, which isn't well captured in Stats 19. So I will briefly go through a couple of things we're doing here. I spoke about this at last year's Join the Dots. TARN is the trauma registry. People that have been in hospital for 72 hours or more, the more seriously injured casualties. We established the feasibility of linking it to Stats 19. We've got some more data from TARN and we're working through that at the moment, looking at vulnerable road users, so e-scooters, pedal cyclists and motorcyclists. This is the most interesting chart in this presentation, by the way, I think. And it's showing for e-scooter casualties the number of patients in TARN by month since they started collecting it from the start of 2000. The equivalent Stats 19 killed or seriously injured figure, showing a broadly similar trend, and the proportion that are in both data sets. So roughly speaking, a third of the cases that are in TARN are appearing in the police data. So that's what comes back to what Rachel was saying about earlier about the, the underreporting in Stats 19. But what's interesting in this, and I'm hoping to publish something later in the year, is e-scooters are very similar to cyclists in that when they collide with something, they're much more likely to be known to the police, and when someone falls off, they're not. And but the levels of reporting of e-scooters and pedal cyclists are actually quite similar. Where you might think e-scooters being not always legal might be lower. But no. Anyway, watch out for that one. What I'm meant to be talking about is this fire data. So this is another thing we've been exploring the feasibility of. So I will try and speed through this. So I'll just skip a couple of bits. So we've got some data for incidents attended by fire and rescue services in England. It comes from the Home Office. You can identify when they've got a property type as a road vehicle, and you can identify when there are fatalities or casualties. We've got some information on the time and location, which we can use to try and link to Stats 19, and then we've got some variables that we can look at. This is the data. There's around 14,000 incidents for England where there are casualties in the fire service data set. See the familiar dip in 2020, about 500 fatals. I'll skip through this. It's a very crude linking here. We're just looking at distance and time. We don't have any other common variables, or we didn't when we started doing this. But actually, you can see from that chart at the top, when you look at the closest incidents, the distance is often very close and the time is often very close. So you rely on the sparsity of the data sets to think your matching is probably not too bad. I'll skip through this one as well, which is just the summary of the initial results for the latest year. But if you just look at the bold line at the bottom, RS is the fire data set, and that's the proportion of records in the fire data that we're linking to Stats 19. So for where it's fatal, where there's a fatality, it's 84%, and when there's an injury but not a fatality, it's by 70%. So, okay, probably not as good as it could be. A little bit of work to do on the matching method. We can look at trends over time. Blue is the police data, red is the fire data, purple is the linked. These are indexed back to 2011. Broadly speaking, I would say for fatal incidents, we're seeing similar trends. There's something to me quite interesting on the right-hand side there, where the fire data for non-fatal incidents is showing a flatter trend. But that needs some further investigation. I won't dwell on these next two. We're short of time. So we've got a bit more work to do on this. We've just got some more data from the Home Office, which will help us to validate the linkage. We've got some information on casualties, age and sex, which we can use to compare. We need to establish whether it's actually got any value. So if anyone's got any thoughts on that, or is doing anything similar in their local area, it'd be really interesting to know. And if we get anywhere, we'll publish something in due course. What I think is worth mentioning is that some related work is being done by the National Fire Chiefs Council, looking at demand management risk mapping. And what's interesting about that is, unfortunately, it's not quite finalised. So it'd be a good talk for a future conference, I think. But what's interesting is they are using the Stats 19 data rather than that Home Office fire data, partly because it's a bigger sample size, but also because they've identified some limitations in the Home Office data. So that's a note of caution for us. And Hannah, whose name's at the bottom there, and contact details at the bottom, if you're interested in finding out more about that work, very happy to be contacted. We've got more work that we're planning in line with that future data strategy. This is just what we're doing in DFT in Great Minster House, as Eva would put it. So the things in bold are the things we're going to focus on most over the next year. It'd be great to hear, perhaps not now, but in due course, about what other things other people are doing. But looking at whether we've made some progress in exploring APIs. TARN, I think, has got some really interesting insights. And then the coroner's data on prevention of future death reports. There's a data scientist who's working on something to scrape all that information together. And hopefully, if that works, we'll be able to publish that as some sort of data set that other people can use if no one else is doing it. Just to conclude, so the next steps. I've said smallish steps. These are the things within control of DFT and the stats team there. Not all of them are that small, so implementing the review is a pretty big thing. I've spoken about the things we're doing to link to different data sets. So we will do what we can, but there's some big game-changing opportunities and things coming here, which unfortunately aren't quite ready to be talked about. Catherine's mentioned the data strategy, but the road safety investigation branch is another one which, when it's on a more official footing, hopefully there'll be a talk from Rachel or someone Rachel's around somewhere, yeah, we'll perhaps tell you more about that. But a lot of work to build intelligence and data for that branch, which will be really exciting. And as a final point, I can see Bruce getting up to wind me up. If there's anyone here from areas where your police force hasn't yet moved to crash, it would be a huge step forward if we could actually get to a point where all the forces were on, not necessarily crash, but a crash or an equivalent system, so that actually not only could we produce the statistics and publish the data more quickly, we wouldn't really have to do a Stats 19 review again in the same way in the future, because it would just be one system to be updated, and it wouldn't take years. It could be done much more quickly. So there we go. I've left some questions for you when slides go round. If you've got any thoughts on that, please do get in touch with us, and feel free to contact Paul if you want to know more about the review.
Could I ask you all to show your appreciation for Matthew? Thank you. An absolutely magnificent exercise in fast talking, Matthew. You were choosing a speed appropriate for the conditions. Little Stats 19 joke there, so congratulations for that. If any of you have got questions about the business of integrating other data sets with Stats 19, please do approach Matthew and his team. I know they'd be very interested to hear from you. Personally, I'm particularly excited about the link with Tarn, and I very much hope that that's developed in an interesting way in the near future, particularly in connection with e-scooters. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on there. So we have overrun a little bit, but we are going to stop now for a brief comfort break of 10 minutes? 15 minutes. Steve's feeling generous. So we will return at 3:15. If anybody online has got questions you'd like to put to speakers in the room, please pop it in the chat. We'll be happy to follow up on it. We will reconvene at 3:15. Thank you all very much, and thank you to the speakers.